Merissa, thank you very much for joining us this evening. So the Wilson Centre has recently released its new report, Ready for Work, an analysis of workforce asymmetries in the Middle East and North Africa. Talk us through some of those headline findings from that report.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for Viewpoint for hosting this. So we've basically broken down the workforce challenge in the MENA region into supply and demand issues. And of course, those who follow the news on the Middle East, particularly on socioeconomics, know very well that the region has one of the highest youth unemployment rates and one of the lowest female labor participation rates. There are other challenges associated with the workforce, but this was sort of one way to break down the workforce formula, supply and demand. And of course, there are asymmetries, and this is why the report is looking at how we can sort of bridge that gap. So on the supply side, it is primarily an issue of gaps, a skills mismatch between what the education sector is producing and what the market is demanding, and need for education reform, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. The vocational and technical education and training is in dire need of a complete overhaul, precisely because of how it is stigmatized in the MENA region. And on the demand side, it is a matter of basically challenges that SMEs face in accessing markets, accessing capital. There are constraints for growth. There is good news in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, but I think there's a lot more to be done. And so we're tackling basically all of these components, and we dedicated a whole chapter to women in the workforce because, if anything, that's the one missing key to sort of unlocking the potential. After all, they're half of the population across the region.
Absolutely. You spoke there about a skills gap. Now, specifically, what are some of those skills? Is it a case of a lack of soft skills to complement those hard skills? What is that?
I think it's a two-partite issue. So on the one hand, yes, it is very much the soft skills. We are referring to them as essential skills. So it's communications, presentation, adaptability, flexibility, leadership, teamwork, independent thinking, etc. But it's also sort of the technical skills that are sort of dated. So the educational sector is producing, graduates with dated technical skills, and so this is where this gap in communication between higher education and the private sector has to be bridged with not only ad hoc communications, but a systematic way to communicate and to work together in order to make sure that there's constant labor data being fed into both the education sector and the labor market in order to bridge that gap.
Sure. The report emphasises that the reforms are needed. In which areas do we see that those reforms are actually necessary, and is the system even ready for reform on quite a big scale?
The system has to be ready because it doesn't have a choice. If we are going to move forward with further technological disruptions, ecological and demographic disruptions in the future, we have absolutely no choice but to reform education. So I think again it's a matter of reforming the curriculum, so introducing technology into the classroom, ensuring that the content is gender positive. And then you have the pedagogy, so moving from rote learning and didactic learning to more participatory and sort of learning by doing approach. And there are, of course, good examples in the region where this is already happening, but when we're looking at the public school system, it's still very traditional in the way that we've seen it before, with the memorization and copy pasting.
And who's really responsible for driving that reform? Is it left to the ministries, or is there a level needed at the schools as well themselves?
It has to be led by the government. So it has to be led by the ministries of education. But I think the push has to also come from the private sector, because they are the ones who are complaining that they're not finding the skills they need, whether technical or soft skills. So I think it has to be an effort by both to meet halfway and lead that reform.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at the demand side of things. Do you believe that the current policy goes far enough to tackle the barriers to international investment coming into the region that really are so crucial in unlocking demand for new skills and providing jobs?
I think it depends on where you're looking in the region. Our report basically focuses on 3 countries, Tunisia, Jordan, and Oman, one sort of each representing a sub-region of the MENA region and with similar economies. So there is progress with regards to reforming legislation in order to open up basically the economies for business and facilitate foreign direct investment and also strengthen entrepreneurship in general. But there's a lot more to be done in that on that front, and beyond just sort of introducing new legislation, you need to also train public sector employees to implement this new legislation. So you can set up a one-stop shop for FDI, but then you have to make sure that everybody's ready and coordinated in the government so that this actually happens and it works. And we often heard from the over 60 interviews that we've done across the region and in Washington that it's not just about passing legislation, it's about ensuring effective implementation.
Absolutely. And how would you assess the kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem in the region and actually giving graduates the opportunities and I suppose the tools to actually go out and start their own jobs and launch their own careers and create their own jobs? How would you assess that environment?
So I think, again, that's sort of the beacon of hope in the report. The entrepreneurship story in the region is one that bodes well, but there's a lot more work to do. We see most graduates wanting to go to the public sector because it's stable, it's secure, and there's a prestige element to it as well. We also suffer from what psychologist Carol Dweck refers to as the fixed mindset, where when we face a challenge or we fail, we don't see it as an opportunity for growth. And I think this is where reforming the education system and pedagogies in particular is crucial, so that our youth in the region are able to learn from their failures rather than just drop out completely. And risk-taking is not exactly our forte in the region, so I think those are the elements that need to be introduced. But I'm very hopeful. We were just in Jordan, Director Jane Harmon, myself, and my co-author Alex Farley, and we listened to pitches of women entrepreneurs at an incubator called Injaz. And it was very refreshing to see that things are moving in that direction, and we see a lot of incubators and accelerators being set up all across.